A very good morning, everybody. Welcome to this, the third in our series of building safety webinars. I hope this finds you all very well and you've had a good start to 2022. For those that have not joined previous webinars, my name is Ian Fletcher. I'm Director of Policy at the BPF and going to chair this session today. As you'll know, if you joined the second session, a theme that I've started is in sort of typical Linda Bald fashion. The flowers, so the irises are gone and replaced with tulips, and we'll see if that continues into future webinars. Quite by chance having the tulips rather than it being by design. For those that have joined us before, you'll know that we like to sort of mix the format around a little bit, and today we are going to focus on a sort of more of a sort of traditional panel session. To start us off, we've got our regular contributor and expert, David Hills from ARC Workplace Risk. David is going to explain some of the issues to consider in preparing for the golden thread. I think he's going to look at that from the perspective of both new buildings, but also legacy buildings. And I'm sure we'll provide an excellent introduction of about 20 minutes to our session. I'm then delighted to welcome our two panelists. Catherine Metcalf is Legal Director at Pinsent Mason. Has great insight on building safety matters. I know both north and south of the border, and is a keen sort of follower of building safety bill and the regulations that go with that, and always find that Catherine's sort of bang up to date in terms of what's happening. So looking forward to her contribution. And then our other panelist is Laura Bryant. Delighted to welcome Laura as Director of Operational Risk Management and Health and Safety Europe at Greystar. Really looking forward to Laura giving us insights on her preparations for Golden Thread and building safety more generally. And for those that don't know, Greystar, large American institutional investor into the build-to-rent sector and student accommodation. So a little bit of a sort of different perspective than some of the sort of leasehold perspectives that we'd had in previous sessions. So really grateful to everybody on the panel for joining us today. As said, we're going to kick off with a sort of presentation. We'll then give Catherine and Laura about 2 to 3 minutes each, just to give their sort of first reactions, perspectives, then get into discussion and Q&A. And for our audience, if you want to participate in Q&A, could you use the Q&A function on Zoom rather than the chat function? And we'll try and pick up your questions in the latter half of the webinar. So without further delay, I'll let David go through his presentation. Welcome, David.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all well. Yes, David Hills, I'm Senior Director here at ARC. I'm going to take you through this morning the golden thread. Specifically though, as we have on previous sessions, just want to make sure that we are all aware that I'm going to take you through what the current view is in respect of the golden thread, both in respect of the bill as it stands at the moment and the draft regulations that sit behind it. Obviously, clearly things could change in the future. We don't expect them to change very much, but just a word of caution in respect of that. So, why a golden thread? Well, following the Grenfell Tower tragedy, the government asked Dame Judith Hackett, as we all know, to look at building safety. And she produced her independent review. And what she was effectively looking at and actually recommended was that we needed a thread of information, the golden thread, as she called it. And she wanted to use that golden thread to start changing the approach to how we consider building safety and how we consider buildings. And she really wants us to look at buildings as holistic systems rather than how traditionally we have been looking at safety by very much a silo based. You're looking at fire safety, you're looking at general safety, you're looking at maintenance. The objective here is to make sure that we look at this on a holistic basis and we're looking to actually make sure that the building is safe. Now, the idea of the golden thread is to support that holistic approach, but also provide that information that's necessary so organisations and the accountable persons and duty holders are able to therefore design, construct, and then operate their buildings safely and efficiently. So the duty holders obviously clearly there are in respect of designers, contractors, and those who are actually ultimately going to be operating that particular building. And the other element as well that she was very, very clear about, which is where actually we have been failing as an industry, is to ensure that the information that we actually have is actually then passed down throughout the life cycle of the building. If I'm brutally honest, a significant number of organisations that we work with struggle with this, especially as they are our owner managers, in the fact that they just don't have the previous information in respect of that particular building. So we know why we need a golden thread. What is the golden thread? Well, we have some draft regulations that sit behind the actual bill. And this one happens to be called the Building Higher Risk Buildings England Regulations. And that clearly sets out in part 5 of that some very, very clear requirements and high-level requirements in respect of what the golden thread is and when it is needed to be actually undertaken. But I think it's very clear we need to be focused here that the focus of the statutory instrument as it stands at the moment is really focused on the gateways that are contained within the bill, gateway 1, 2, and 3, rather than looking at legacy buildings or existing stock. So I think that's really important that we understand that so far that focus really doesn't consider the legacy element. So obviously what this is trying to do as well is to affirm the government's approach of digital first. Technology is going to be key. In fact, the actual regulations, draft regulations, talk about the use of certain portals that will have to be used in order to actually transfer and store the information so the regulator has access to them. In addition to that, the draft regulations talk about the need to have holistic and historic versions of those documents so that we have a thorough understanding of how the document has changed, how the design has changed, how the building has changed through its entire life cycle. And then in addition to that, what the government are looking to do is to actually include some form of guidance, and it refers to the provision of approved guidance. Now, at the moment, we believe that approved guidance is going to come from the British standards, but again, we need to make sure that that is going to be included within the regulations as they pass through Parliament. So, we have this primary legislation, the Building Safety Bill, that's setting out the high-level elements of what we're looking to achieve here. And in addition to that, we are going to have secondary legislation, the Golden Thread regulations, or the higher risk building regulations anyway, that will set out the specific requirements of what's required and when that information needs to be stored, available, and passed through to the various parties. And in addition to that, we're going to have guidance, as I said. Now, the Building Regulation Advisory Council, working under the Department for Levelling Up, have produced a report back in last July, which gave us an overview of what they have felt the golden thread should be. And their definition is that information is having to be stored that will allow you to understand your building, as well as the steps needed to keep both the building and the people safe now and in the future. So that's basically the overview definition of what we believe is going to be the golden thread. And in addition to that, they then extended that into a much more detailed definition, in that the golden thread will be information that those who are accountable for the buildings, so accountable persons and principal accountable persons, as well as other accountable persons such as the client, going through the CDM approach, contractors, designers, etc., The information that's going to be there is going to be required, firstly, to show that the building was actually compliant initially with the building regulations during its construction. Secondly, to provide the evidence that they are meeting all of the requirements of the new regime, whichever part of that regime we are in at that time. And lastly, information is provided to prevent or reduce the severity of the consequences of any fire spread or structural collapse within the building. So it's all about making sure that the data about how we initiate the building, inception of the building, design, construction, and then handover, and then obviously subsequent on use of that building is maintained, so that those who are responsible going forward throughout the life cycle of that building actually understand what it is and how that building was developed, so they can make informed decisions on future building safety requirements. I think the other element as well is that BRAC made it clear that this series of documents was going to actually be supporting the traditional, or the new, building safety approach that's within the regime. So as we've discussed before, there is a need for accountable persons when they operate buildings, and principal accountable persons, to develop a safety case. And the idea is that this documentation, the golden thread of documentation, is there to actually support accountable persons in developing that safety case. It isn't going to be the ultimate safety case. It is, the safety case report will be separate and will point to all of the documentation that's applicable in order to satisfy the regulator and support the claim that it is safe to operate and safe to occupy. So that's the definitions that we currently have in respect of the golden thread. So what documentation are we expecting to be within the golden thread? Well, first things first, we have a brand new code that should be out in April. It's been out for draft and consultation, and that is BS 8644. And I'm going to have to read it out because it's the Digital Management of Fire Safety Information Part 1, Design, Construction, Handover, Asset Management and Emergency Response Code of Practice. So BS 8644 is being developed very much to allow us to actually exchange information. And they've set out some very clear, what they call information exchange points. The first one is the brief. The brief, they are expecting that the brief will therefore be then transferred through from the owner or person who's undertaking the inception of the building through to the design team. And that's going to outline their fire safety legislation requirements, any material assessments, any initial drawings, any schedules of requirements, etc., details of any planning constraints and the like. Going on from that, the next information is provided through to the designers, and the designers will then have to provide the contractors through another information exchange point, details of the design criteria, fire strategy or initial fire strategy, drawings, elevations, compartmentation requirements, etc., along with the fire statement. So it's very much following the gateway requirements. And then contractors are going to be expected, once they've gone through construction, through the contract process, and in another information exchange point, and handover information such as in details of the construction phase plan, construction phase risk assessments, and then all of the expected commissioning certificates, etc. Now, in the design element, you'll notice there's a terminology there called key building information. And one of the elements within the regulations is that there is a very defined set of key information that has to be provided at various times. As you can see in the draft regulations at the moment, it's within X number of days. And that information sets out what it is that the regulator needs at its initial part, so they can actually deal with the arrangements and construction of the building. So that regulation sets out a huge amount, and this is not all of them. It takes up 2 pages of the actual regulations at the moment. So this actually sets out the type of information that the regulator is expecting to be uploaded through their portal, so they can actually ensure that the regulatory process is being followed. So it's details, for example, of the external facade facilities and any insulation materials, percentage covering. We're also looking at areas such as even down to the number of sprinkler heads expected. So a huge amount of data that's going to have to be provided that will actually support ultimately the building assessment certificate as well. So that's the draft regulation. So let's go back to BS 8644, because the next information exchange point is the handover documentation. So what we're expecting to see is handover information such as built fire strategies, as-built plans and drawings, final commissioning test certificates and certificates of approval, etc., O&M manuals, as well as that key building information. So all of that has to therefore be handed over to persons who are in control of the premises, as well as the accountable persons. And then from then, the next information exchange point is what we call in use. And so what the code is expecting is for us to actually make sure that we've got all of the available documentation captured in respect of how that building is being managed. So we're looking at issues such as the fire safety manual, the safety case, which will have to be provided to the regulator, fire risk assessments, and not just the current, but future previous fire risk assessments for existing stock, the emergency plans, residents' engagement strategy, etc., all the way down to information that you would expect within a premises information box, and then going forward, looking at asset and amendment details for when properties are changed, refurbed, etc. So as you can see, I mean, and this is, by the way, is not a full list of all of the documents. These are the typical documents that are included within the draft code, which, as I say, should be out sometime in April. Okay, so handover documentation, it's been a bit sketchy. In respect of that, what I'm saying is that I would suggest probably about 15 to 20% of our clients actually get a complete set of handover documentation when they take over responsibility of a building. There has been, and Dame Judith highlighted this, a significant issue with handing over that information. In addition to that, that handover information is incredibly vital for those who are going to manage the building in use, because they need to understand why certain decisions were made. Why was it that a particular type of detector head was included within an area? Why was it that a particular design of system was actually included within the building? So the objective of this is to make sure that all of that information gets to the right people at the right time so they can deal with the safety case. So handover information, a bit sketchy. In-use information is a lot easier. A lot of managers will keep up-to-date records and historical records of all of their actions and facilities management arrangements. So I think it's fair to say that whilst it would look to be relatively easy or easier during build and construction to develop this information, as long as we've got systems in place, dealing with that information in legacy stock is incredibly hard. And the only way we can see, the only way approach that we feel is actually necessary here is to actually reverse engineer. Start with what you have, start with the information that you actually have in respect of a building. We're talking legacy buildings here. And then work your way back for what information is actually appropriate to the actual building, rather than all of the information that I'm saying here. Now, what I would say is that in our experience, we have noted, and in discussion with many of our clients, they've taken on buildings, for example, that have come out of administration. They've got absolutely no hope of getting brief and design information And in addition to that, we've had some situations where designers have been a little wary about providing additional information without some sort of either payment or some protection in respect of any future action against them. So we certainly know that it's going to be extremely difficult to reverse engineer and gather all of this information. So that's the type of information that we are expecting to see in the golden thread. Our approach and our advice to all of our clients is start with what you have and work your way backwards to as far as you can go. If we try and do it the other way, it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult. Okay, the BRAC team have also produced some very clear principles about how the golden thread should be developed and therefore continually maintained. And they're effectively saying that the documentation that you hold has got to be accurate and it's got to be trusted. Therefore, it's got to be structured and verified information and available to all of those in use. It's got to assure residents, because residents will have access to this information. It's got to be able to support the claim of being able to manage that building safely and assure that the residents, that the accountable person and the accountable persons are doing their job. It's got to be an enabler for change in the way that we actually manage and deal with information throughout the design, construction and management processes. And so what the BRAC are looking for is to make sure that this actually is an enabler for more collaborative working. In addition to that, we're looking to make sure that we have this single source of truth and effectively encourage common data environments. They're not saying that everyone has to use the same system, but ultimately those systems have got to be able to talk to each other and the information has got to be able to be passed from one system to the other with some sort of commonality. Obviously and clearly, any information held has got to be held securely. There's got to be protocols in place to ensure that that security of information is there. So we're going to need to make sure that information, especially information regarding any GDP element, is held securely and properly. And the bill allows for GDP requirements in respect of the transfer of information from the various parties. The BRAC approach as well is to actually drive accountability, and it's really here is to make sure that we're talking about accountability throughout the whole process: design, construction and ownership. So it's at every level is where we're looking to drive that accountability. And also it's got to be very, very clear and understandable, so the user can really understand and get to the information easily without having to search too much, and very much focused on the user's needs. So the use of jargon and terminology is something that we're going to have to consider. It's got to be accessible, easy to find, easy to update, because it's going to have to be updatable and therefore easy to extract. As I said, it's got to be shareable. It's got to be formatted in a way that allows for that handover of information through the different software systems. And finally, it's got to be relevant and proportionate. And what I'm going back here is saying that if you are starting from an existing housing stock, the information that you're going to get has got to be relevant to your safety case. You may not require all of the information in the briefing elements. You may not require all of the design elements. You're certainly going to need an amount of construction data. You've got to make sure that the information that you've actually collated and collected, stored and made available is relevant to the actual building and proportional to the risks that for that particular building as well. So we've got the traditional information that we're going to have. That information is going to be around, having details of your fire risk appraisal of your external wall, your fire risk assessment, your strategies, your management plans and your floor plans. And you're going to have other bits and pieces that come out of this process, so key building information, O&M manuals, Section 38 data, and any gateway information, such as that information we've just gone through in respect of BS 8644. You're also then going to have the other information that supports certainly ongoing properties. So your general risk management, compliance and assessments, your day-to-day testing, servicing and examination records, and any other FM records that will support the development of the safety case and therefore develop this single version of the truth. The other mandatory information would then go into your storage system, whatever common data environment that you're going to have, and the accountable person and principal accountable persons will therefore have a duty to manage this whole process. And then it's their duty to make sure that that information is made available, not only to the regulator and the new building safety manager, but also the resident and the residents as well, but of course to the managing agents, because after all, they are responsible persons and they are effectively going to be managing the property on a day-to-day basis. In addition to that, you're going to have information coming from other sources, and very importantly, if an accountable person or principal accountable person decides to move the building on, then there's going to be a need to actually transfer to the next accountable person or principal accountable persons. So you can see that technology is going to play a key role in this particular part and process. So final couple of slides then. There is a need to maintain the golden thread on an ongoing basis. And that, I think, is where that big culture change is going to have to be in place. We're going to have to make sure that we're able to capture all of the golden thread information, so all of this type of stuff that goes through to actually make up our golden thread, that allows us to build our safety case, to actually ensure that software is coordinating the whole approach. So we've got some form of document management process or common data environment. Now, we then are going to have the different parties, the principal accountable persons, the property managers, etc. And each of those various groups are going to have to continually maintain and update those documents. So we're going to have to make sure we've got adequate version control, keeping everything up to date, dealing with and monitoring and maintaining records about how you want to take any follow-up actions from any particular requirements, and then sharing that information of what is relevant to firstly the regulator and then also to residents as well. So you can see ongoing maintenance and management of the golden thread, again, is going to require that software solution to actually there to support and coordinate that whole process. So the golden thread, just to finish this particular part up, the golden thread is very clearly excuse me, a key element of the new building safety regime. It is very clearly based around principles of gathering, of verifying, of storing, and then being able to share that key information so that we can support the accountable persons and support accountability and engagement with all of the relevant parties. We are aware that we've got British standard guidance that is coming out or due to be out in April 2022. We've clearly got regulations that are in draft form that sit behind the bill at the moment that will point us to whatever guidance the government feel is appropriate. But I think it's very clear that we can see that the regulations and the current guidance is very clearly focused on gateway information. And for the vast majority, we've got to consider legacy buildings. And I don't believe at the moment that we're sufficiently looking at that, or the guidance certainly is not sufficiently looking at that and the issues and problems that those with legacy buildings are going to face. And then clearly, as I said, technology is going to play a major role in this whole process. So hopefully, Ian, I've taken you through the requirements for the golden thread in hopefully just over 20 minutes. So I will stop sharing and pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, David. Packed in a lot there, and we've got a number of sort of points of clarification from the audience coming through, which we'll pick up in a few minutes' time. If I just clarify one, actually, which is this session, yes, is recorded, and we will make it available on the BPF's YouTube channel. So That normally goes up about a day after the event. And I think all of the audience has sort of sent a link to that. So look out for that. Anybody that wants the slides, yes, obviously we'll put you in touch with David on that as well, so that you can get the slides. Without further ado, let me turn to Catherine, who's just going to give us her perspectives on what David said and what she's been picking up on the golden thread more generally.
Thanks, Ian. Well, a lot of what I'm seeing absolutely echoes many of the main points that David made. I think we all keep hearing from Judith Hackett that people need to start getting ready now, and she's, I think, quite impatient for duty holders to get started on this journey, and that's all very well. It's a good sentiment, but I think there is a real problem here when we don't have detailed guidance or detailed understanding of what it is that we're supposed to be doing. It's very difficult to start getting the right systems in place to manage all of this golden thread data, particularly for legacy buildings. A big gap for me at the moment that's missing is this structural safety piece, because of course building safety is not just fire safety, it's structural safety too, and particularly the BS 8644 is entirely focused on fire safety information, and I think it's a real shame that they haven't captured the structural part of that too. And I know a lot of my clients are scratching their heads going, we don't know what type of information it is that we are expected to gather to form that part of the safety case. So that's a big gap for me at the moment. I also see, huge challenges with this type of record keeping. I'm a lawyer. We love records. It's absolutely crucial to demonstrating compliance to the regulator. It's going to be really important if something does go wrong in a building to be able to show that you have that comprehensive management system in place. But having those records in place for the whole life cycle of a building is a really big ask, even with the digital capability that we have. If I look back 30 years and how we were storing information then, looking forward 30 years, I actually don't know how we future-proof these systems to make sure that the digital systems we put in place now are still actually fit for purpose by the time we stop using and come to demolish some of the buildings that we're talking about. I think that's a huge challenge. The other thing that I think is really interesting that we're starting to see, and I've probably run over by a little bit here, but I'll make one final point, is that there seems to be a huge emphasis in the draft regulations that are coming out now on the client role in all of this. And I think that's key to getting the right systems in place and getting the right records. It's really upfront client engagement and what they want to gathered during construction of new buildings, how they want that to be managed and stored, so that they then go into becoming an accountable person for a building with a system that's fit for purpose that they can update.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And yeah, some of your really useful points there, I think, in flagging role of the client, for example. And we've had some questions on that, so we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a moment or two. Thank you for your contribution. And if I could ask Laura to give perspective from those that are owning, managing, investing in buildings.
Hi everybody, nice to meet you. My name's Laura Bryant. I have a very long job title, as I think Ian spoke about in the beginning. And I think for me, I kind of thought it'd be worth almost explaining kind of who Greystar are, and then if you've got a bit of a background, how kind of like we have had to kind of move forward in order to kind of like start to think about how the building safety bill will affect us. So we work in the build to rent industry. Obviously, that's a little different from lots of you on the call who kind of be working with people who are kind of buying buildings and buying them directly from contractors. But we, in the build to rent industry, we have on-site management teams. So we have 24/7 management. we'll have a property manager and maintenance on site. So I think for kind of like our accountability piece, we're in a good place. But I certainly think when we're talking about the golden thread, we have gaps. Thinking about it from a construction development perspective, when we are being handed over buildings, we find, as David mentioned, that we receive documentation that's late, documentation that has gaps in, and actually there's those pieces of information that you need to think about in terms of how that documentation is being handed over to you. It's all very well being handed over a great set of as-built drawings, but actually if they come in PDF, what does that mean for your business when you have to keep updating those documents with version control? And version control is going to be really important to us where we are thinking about what that golden thread looks like, and think about the costs it means if you have to go back and redraw all those drawings because you only have PDF versions that are unedited. I think it's also a software piece. So at Greystar, we have many clients as a kind of like development manager, and those clients have different requirements. So whereas in the public sector, where, for example, taking BIM to stage 2 may be a standard, that's not something that's actually standard for us in the private sector. And our clients will say to us, actually, I don't want to use BIM on this project. We don't see it adds value. And others will say, no, we want to take BIM to stage 3. So from a management perspective, that's very difficult for us because when we're trying to store documentation, we're storing it in lots of different sources. One of the things we're working at is finding one digital source that we can use to store all of our information and make sure that we can store that information from pre-construction all the way through to operations. And that maintenance information, as we said, is going to be really important when it comes to building that building safety case, not just the first building safety case when you PC a building, but actually the next building safety case when the building's 5 and 10 years old. And potentially some of those maintenance issues that you don't see post-construction are starting to creep in.
Thank you, Laura. And yeah, thank you for that perspective. Really helpful to have your expertise on the panel as well. We have quite a chunk of questions and discussion points to get through. So I'm going to sort of dive straight in. And there's a couple that have sort of come in that I'll try and group some questions together as we go through. So James had asked, how does the golden thread framework ensure genuinely as built rather than as described? And there was one came in from Steve, just asking, what are gateways? So I thought group those two together. Who would like to answer those two questions? David, Catherine?
The gateways effectively are a series of literal gateways that are enshrined within the bill. So we have the first gateway 1 is regarding planning, gateway 2 is regarding building control, and gateway 3 is in respect of completion of the building and handover of the building. So the idea of the gateways is to actually ensure that we have a very clear regime in place and very clear definitive times where information has to be handed over from one party to another through these information exchange points. Sorry, the second part of the question there?
It was from James, and it was around, does the sort of golden thread framework ensure that genuinely you're getting information that's as built rather than simply as described?
In our experience, and we've often seen, and Laura was mentioning there, as-built information that when you actually go and firstly have a look at the property, it is not how the property has been built. We found as-built drawings showing balconies on a particular building where those balconies have actually been removed during the process. So one of the important elements that the accountable person has got to take on is to verify. And so I think there's going to be probably a mini industry set up to actually be able to take the golden thread of information and verify that information on those properties And so I see that particular process in place. That's the only way that the accountable person and principal accountable persons are going to be able to actually satisfy themselves that what they've got is actually as-built plans and drawings.
I think, Ian, if I might just come in there too, I think those involved in construction will begin to apply much more rigour to this, because they will have to not only hand over this information to the accountable person and the principal accountable person, they need to submit it to the health and safety executive to get a completion certificate. So there's a real incentive for those involved in construction. And during that construction phase too, HSE is going to be much more hands-on in making sure that people build what they say they're going to build. They want to see a construction control plan from the contractor. They want to see that greater sort of quality assurance and checking as the build progresses. And I think that will also drive much more accurate information being handed over at that third gateway.
And I think, if you don't mind me interjecting, that actually that's where David's point about legacy buildings becomes really, really key, because where we have buildings that are going through that construction phase and are going through those gateways now, we're going to have fantastic documentation because we're learning quickly. But if you think about those buildings that are 15, 20 years old, they are likely to have gone through significant capital project refurbishments up until this point. And that documentation won't necessarily have been updated to the same standard as anything in a new development. I certainly know in many of my assets, we have, refurbished reception areas, added more amenity spaces. And when I go and check that documentation, just because of the culture of our industry, it's not there. And we therefore need to go back and update that. So it's those legacy buildings we've got to pay particular attention to.
That sort of nicely segues, thank you, Olivia, on to a question from Jamie, which was around can you force those further down the supply chain to provide the information to you if you know they have that information? Is there anything within the legislation that says I can force you to give me that information?
I would it'd be interested what Catherine's thought is. I don't believe that there is anything in there that actually forces or provides the accountable person the power to demand. I mean, they can demand it, but actually receiving it is a completely different matter. Catherine, I'll be interested in your thoughts there.
No, I agree with that, David. This new legislation will give the health and safety executive power to insist on information, but it's not going to give the accountable person a power to get that from their supply chain. You have to fall back on what's in the contract to get that. So again, for new contracts, we can draft in the right provisions to make sure we're getting the information that's required, but it's harder for legacy buildings, particularly if you've got a supply chain that just isn't in existence anymore.
Yeah.
And Nick asks, who manages this information? I think we've covered that in the presentations, but
ultimately the accountable person or principal accountable persons are accountable for managing this information at the end of the day in respect of a legacy building. And as Catherine was saying, during construction, it is for the client to manage that information during that process.
And I think, one of the things Greystar's been working on for some time, because we have this kind of construction handed over to operations, and we learned very early on in our business that actually, even though we were one business, we weren't doing a good job of that. Our development managers weren't handing over all the tools for our operations managers to be able to manage the buildings well. It's that soft landings piece, actually. And so I'd recommend anyone out there who's focusing on the operations piece and that link in that chain to start looking into what soft landings looks like, so that information transfer happens. Because I think it's more than just documents, it's knowledge.
And we had another question come in on BIM, and if you're building a building now, are you almost sort of forced to use BIM because of the information requirements that are going to be imposed on you going forward? And then we also had a question around, let me just have a look. There's a fundamental one which I think comes up a lot, which is what is classed as a high risk building. Are we just talking about high-rise residential buildings when we're talking about the information requirements provision of the Golden Thread?
In respect to the definition of a high-rise or a high-risk building, that definition is in the bill. We're talking about any building that contains sleeping accommodation. There are some exclusions in respect of that are over 18 metres or 7 stories. But very clearly the bill gives the Secretary of State the option to actually change the scope of the bill, both in respect of the size of the buildings and type of buildings, but also the scope in respect of the subject matter. Catherine was talking about the fact that, yes, the code of practice that's been developed so far is very fire focused, and we don't have enough information at the moment in respect of structural stability. But there is an option for the Secretary of State to extend the building safety bill into other areas. The question of BIM, well, it's that question, isn't it? To BIM or not to BIM? That is the question. One of the things I would say is that the current guidance, or certainly the draft guidance, did say that you don't have to go down the BIM route. That there are other solutions that are out there, other platforms. We have a platform ourselves that we use, CUDA, which allows us to actually manage and monitor both document history, version control, etc. So there isn't a need for BIM. Yes, clearly BIM is certainly where Dame Judith and then the industry was looking at. And I can understand in respect of legacy buildings, it's going to be incredibly difficult in respect of a legacy building to go down that particular route. Yeah, and kind of, client side backing up really what David says, that we talk about BIM a lot. I do think, there are huge benefits to it. And I think once you've made that initial investment into projects, you do reap the rewards from a cost perspective, but it is expensive and it's not the only route. And, Greystar, similar to what David was discussing, we're using a system called Create Master, slightly different route that will be able to kind of like track all of our information, version history, and who's had access to that outdated information. Will we BIM in the future? I'm sure we will, but we've also, as David said, got to think about all our legacy buildings and all the investment we need to be putting into that too. So I think you've got to look at it on a case-by-case basis, actually, and some buildings are right for BIM and others aren't, and you've got to find other solutions whilst knowing where all of that different information is if you're splitting it up.
Couple of questions that have come in on sort of content of the Golden Thread. First, from Alex, does the security strategy constitute part of the Golden Thread? And then one from Sue, which was looking at this sort of issue of legacy buildings. And are there parts of the Golden Thread that are essential versus sort of nice to have if you're trying to collate that sort of legacy information? Are there key things that you need?
I think there's going to be certainly some key documents that are required in order to justify the safety case, and that's what it's going to have to be down to. What documents, what evidence are you going to be able to have in order to prove your claim that the building is safe to occupy? It comes down to this relevant and proportionate principle. Do you need all of the documents that are in the current guidance? I would suggest not. I would suggest you need to get as much of those to start off with so that the safety case has got that initial information. But going forward, when we get some further guidance, I mean, we have got some guidance from HSE on what the safety case is going to need to actually cover, then certainly I would suggest that you need to get as much information as possible, some of which probably won't be required, but it's going to be helpful in developing your safety case.
Who ultimately is paying for this information? Are you able to recharge the costs of collecting this information through the service charge? Catherine, yeah.
I could pick that one up. Yep. You won't be able to recover this cost through the service charge once the bill comes into force, but there will be almost a sort of separate regime for recovering what are called building safety costs, and that will work a lot like service charge, and it will cover this type of information, maintaining the golden thread, keeping the safety case up to date, and so on. That there are provisions around how you have to go about recovering the cost of that. You have to be transparent with the leaseholders about what you're spending money on. You have to provide them with detailed accounts up front, and you have to give them a certain period of time to consider that before you invoice it. But yeah, that will be recoverable. And I think it will be a not inconsiderable cost in keeping all of this up to date.
Clearly, Laura, not in a position you are in terms of presumably you're having to pick up all the costs. This is a rental product.
Yeah. So obviously, like in my industry, being built to rent, and kind of like the way the structure is, it will be the owners of the building or our partners, investors that are picking up those costs. So yeah, different structure there, and potentially, makes it a lot easier because, our investors are in this for the long term, and when they're thinking about the whole building rather than just one flat within, obviously the costs kind of like the percentage is different.
And a question from Matt and Wildheart, who's asking, would you suggest trying to get the same level of documentation for buildings that are 11 to 18 meters high now? I think it comes back to your earlier remark, David, that whilst the scope is set for the moment, provisions in the bill that can extend that scope over time. So is it good practice really to be starting to get lower rise buildings with the same sort of golden thread?
I certainly would recommend it. I mean, we've got to start to think about a changing culture. So if we're going to be changing it for properties that are 18.1 meters, why aren't we changing it for people or buildings that are 17.9 meters? So for me, it's very much a case of we need to change the culture within the industry. That transparency of information and that flow of information, I think, has got to flow so we can satisfy all residents' requirements, not just residents who are in buildings that are actually in scope within the bill as it stands at the moment.
And I think putting my health and safety manager's hat on, actually, to have a decent fire risk assessment document prepared, for your building, you need that information anyway. You shouldn't be assuming that because your building is under 18 meters, it's lower risk. And so therefore, actually, we need all that documentation to fulfill the requirements of the fire risk assessor to give you a report that's competent.
Exactly.
Laura, just building on that point, we're still awaiting, almost another Fire Safety Act to amend the RRO in light of the Home Office consultation last year. And my suspicion is that they will add obligations to the RRO to require you to gather much more detailed information about buildings which are below 18 metres. So I think that is coming in the not too distant future. And for anyone who has properties in Wales, they of course are considering an additional degree of regulation for all residential buildings, not just those over 18 metres. So I can say with some certainty that's a good idea for properties in Wales.
I've got one from Charles that's come back at you, Catherine. It says, thanks. But does that mean that for existing buildings, the owners will likely be able to recover the cost from lessees if the costs are not incurred until after the Act is passed? And then
you can use the service charge regime to recover the costs at the moment until the bill comes into force. If this type of cost is covered by the service charge provisions in the lease.
And I'd like to sort of finish with a question to you all in a moment, which is just around, what should the audience be? If there was one thing that you wanted to give in terms of advice to the audience in terms of preparing, what would it be? But before I ask you that, there was one final question I picked up from Tony on timing, more around the development stages and if you're developing a building now, do you have to comply with any of this?
At this particular moment, it's not. I don't believe it's about compliance. This is about, again, trying to change the culture within the industry. And if that building is going to pass through one of the gateways after the bill has been passed, then you're going to need to start to provide that information at certain times. So for me, it's a simple case of you've got to start working now on it.
Thank you. We've cantered through a lot. Apologies, I've not got to your question. There was a lot on there. There's one or two around the sort of building certification process at Gateway 3, but I think we're planning that one of our future webinars will be on that. And so if you'll forgive me for not covering that today, because we'll cover another one, and it's incentive to come back and join a future webinar in this series. But I'd wanted to turn to that's that sort of last question that I posed, which is, if there was one piece of advice you could give to the audience now in terms of preparing for information provisions of the bill and golden thread, what would it be? I'll do it in alphabetical order. David first, Catherine, then Laura.
Very simple. Start. Get going, because time isn't standing still. If the proposed timetable of October is going to be met, then we're going to have a transition period probably through to May next year. That isn't a long time to get a lot of information together. So start.
Thank you, David, and Catherine.
I would say focus on the big risks. I think you could spend a lot of time gathering a lot of small pieces of fire safety data that don't really change the overall picture. It's what has the potential here to cause a really serious fire or structural collapse of a building. And I think if you look at your information gathering for legacy buildings through that lens, it helps you to focus on what the key issues are.
And I think for me, similarly, it's find out what you've got, what documentation you have currently and what formats it's in. And then from there, we can work out what we need to recreate if it doesn't exist, and where we can get that information from. And the other thing I think is really focus on that cultural change in education within your business, making sure that everyone in your business realizes that this is likely to impact them. It's not just going to impact the people that are dealing with fire safety on a day-to-day basis. Everyone in our business is going to be affected by this new bill because it impacts everyone.
Thank you. So sound advice from all three of you. Really grateful to our audience for their participation, giving us questions, points of clarification today. As said, if you want to look back through the whole of the webinar, about 24 hours time, it will be online on our BPF YouTube channel. We have some thinking to do between myself, David, and colleagues about where we go next with this series. We have a few sort of ideas around topics that we'd like to cover. I've already mentioned building certification. We may like to look at some of the insurance issues around building safety, possibly, although it's not part of the building safety bill itself, but the sort of changes in terms of the sort of fire risk assessment regime. Those are just three topics off the top of my head. If there are others that the audience would like to see us cover, please get in touch. If there's anything that you'd like that flows out of the webinar in terms of points of clarification, contacts you want to make, then my email address, ifletcher@bpf.org.uk. Please get in touch. Thank you very much again to our panelists. Sort of virtual sort of clap to you all, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thank you for joining us.